Hello, good evening. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the virtual ICAS Winter Symposium Veritas. We are very excited to be able to host Ambassador Yuri Kim. Okay, now, Dan, go ahead. Please introduce Ambassador Kim.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Dr. Kim. So it's my privilege to introduce Ambassador Yuri Kim, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs. Ambassador Kim is a career diplomat who served for more than 20 years working on a wide array of foreign policy and national security challenges across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. She was ambassador to the Republic of Albania from 2020 to 2023. She served as Director of Southern European Affairs, Director of the Center for the Study of the Conduct of Diplomacy, and Director of the Office of European Security and Political Military Affairs. Ambassador Kim also served as Chief of Staff to then Deputy Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and earlier in her career as a Special Assistant to Secretary Colin Powell. She was a member of the U.S. delegation to the Six-Party Talks on North Korea nuclear issues. Her other overseas assignments include Turkey, Iraq, the Republic of Korea, Japan, and China. This evening, she'll discuss Russia's war against Ukraine and the evolving impact on the Korean Peninsula. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Kim.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Ambassador Kim is all yours. Go ahead.
All right, great. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to address your group, Dr. Kim and Dan. It's great to be with you. It's a real honor to be with such a distinguished group. As you know, I'm currently now the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia, but I come from a background having started off in East Asia and the Pacific. I grew up on Guam, born in Korea, grew up on Guam, and my first 3 tours in the Foreign Service were in China, Japan, and Korea. So it's very nice to be back to talk about Korean Peninsula issues and to talk about Asia and America's strategy in that part of the world. I'll just begin by saying that this evening, as we sit comfortably behind our computer screens, we're almost a little bit over 2 years removed from Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine. That was February 24th, 2022. And as we enter the 3rd year of Putin's revanchist attempt to rebuild empire, it's important for us to take a moment to reflect on the catastrophe that we're continuing to see unfold before us. So 2 years ago, Vladimir Putin launched his ill-conceived war of ego on a peaceful neighbor. And as Ukrainian families rested in their homes, their vastly larger neighbor, who apparently believed it was not large enough, began bombarding Ukraine from land, sea, and air. It's likely difficult for most of us to imagine what the first moments must have been like. But I think actually for those of us who have studied the Korean Peninsula, some of that might be very relatable. Some people might be able to imagine waking up, not from an alarm clock, but from the scream of ballistic missiles flying overhead, or to head down with family into the subway station so that they wouldn't be killed from the bombs. And at the outset of the war, a nation that is roughly 28 times the size of its neighbor, with a vastly larger military and a vastly larger economy, pretended that it was threatened by a smaller, younger democracy so that it could try to justify launching the largest land war that Europe has seen since World War II. So here we are 2 years later, and according to UN estimates, at least 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed, and at least 20,000 have been wounded. There are millions, of course, who've had to flee their homes. And what's really been appalling for me as I watch what's happening in Ukraine and work with colleagues here to build up our response to that is seeing the degree of willingness by Putin and his cronies to sanction a campaign of in which fathers are killed, mothers are raped, children are stolen, and it's the kind of glorification of death and brutality that we haven't seen in a long, long time. But here's the good news, in a sense. The good news is that 2 years into the full-scale war, it's clear that Putin's war has been and continues to be a strategic failure. Why do I say that? He started this war thinking that it was going to be an easy ride to Kyiv. And you all remember just as clearly as I do, I'm sure, that the world expected in those initial moments that, boy, wasn't it brave for the Ukrainians to stand up to the assault, but they'd soon be overtaken in a matter of days, weeks. But what did Putin actually get? He wanted to subjugate the Ukrainians, and instead what he got is an historic leader of tremendous courage in the form of Zelensky, leading his people to withstand the Russian onslaught for 2 years now. And not only withstand it, but to enable his military with the strong support of the United States and a coalition of more than 50 other countries to take back more than half of the territory that the Russians seized when they initially went into Ukraine. They've done that. They've pushed back the Black Sea Fleet, which nobody could have imagined, and essentially eliminated about 20% of the Black Sea Fleet. That's a hugely significant occurrence. What Putin has also managed to achieve is to make NATO bigger, stronger, and more capable than it's ever been. So we've gone from being an alliance that started out 75 years ago with 12 members, and adding members incrementally over the years, and in particular after the fall of the Berlin Wall, not because we were invading others and compelling them to join us, but because they sought to be part of what is widely hailed as the most effective military alliance, defense alliance that the world has ever seen. And so we've grown from the initial 12 to just today, we're just one step away, I think, from seeing Sweden join and making it 32. So Putin tries to break NATO, tries to drive wedges between the United States and our allies, and instead he ends up turning Finland and Sweden, two countries who have always been non-aligned and were very careful not to do anything to that they thought might anger the Russians, into applying and joining NATO in record time. So you've got strategic failure. And at the same time, we're now in a situation where we're working very hard as far as the administration is concerned to try to keep the 50+ coalition going as strong as ever, and working on our own Congress to get the supplemental funding that we need to support the Ukrainians. And what we do now is extremely important to U.S. leadership in the future. It's going to shape the kind of world that the next few generations of Americans and everybody else around the world are going to face. It's going to come down to a choice between whether we live in a world in which there are rules and laws apply, and whether we are willing to allow big countries to simply redraw the international boundaries at will. I think there's particular alarm now because the bad behavior is arising from a permanent member of the Security Council. And I think this is particularly an issue that we'll want to discuss in this group. Russia has gone from being part of the Security Council that approves resolutions that have condemned and sought to sanction the DPRK's nuclear programs, to address other injustices or violations of international norms, international law that have taken place around the world, to becoming itself a violator of the most basic tenets of the UN Charter. So this is a very precarious moment, and we're very clear that what happens in Ukraine, what the United States does, what Russia does, what Ukraine does, what all of us do in Ukraine is going to be watched very closely by friend and foe alike. So we need to be really thoughtful. We need to be serious, sober, decisive in this moment to make sure that the United States understands that our support for Ukraine is not an act of charity. None of us do this, out of charity. We are supporting Ukraine because of the implications that it has for American power, and what it says about American leadership and resolve to, again, friend and foe alike. And that has huge implications for the United States' relationship with China. It has huge implications for our relationship with our treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, and implications for the kind of world that we are able to build and sustain for generations down the line. So I know for me, it'd be much more interesting to hear your comments and to actually have a conversation. So let me just stop with the remarks there.
ICAS is not an agent of any foreign government or foreign principles. There's no foreign funds involved in the ICAS activities. Okay, with that, Bruce Bennett, are you ready? Go ahead. Bruce.
Yes, sir, I am. Can you tell us anything about the kind of North Korean military presence we are seeing with Russian forces fighting in Ukraine?
So I'm not aware of North Korean military actually fighting in Ukraine, but of course all of us have seen that North Korean weapon systems and missiles are finding their way into the battlefield and are actually being used. So this is a huge concern for all of us, and as I mentioned before, particularly distressing and worrying because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, and they need to be upholding these sanctions rather than being the principal violator of them.
Well, I guess what I was asking was, do we see advisors there? Not so much combat troops, but advisors.
So I haven't, I don't have anything that I can share with you. And I'm not trying to be mysterious or anything. I just don't have that information.
Okay.
Any follow-up question, Bruce?
No, I got it.
Tom Kim, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Yuri Kim. Haven't seen you for a long time. But anyway, responding to your coverage of the situation in Ukraine, what are your views if there is anything South Korea can do to contribute to the improving the situation or eventually come to peace talks between Ukraine and Russia? You think South Korea should provide more ammunition or some other military or material assistance other than political support? at this point, at the juncture?
Yeah, so the Republic of Korea is one of the more than 50 countries that's part of this coalition, and we've seen the ROK provide Ukraine with not just political support but actual defense support, and we'd like to see more of those materials going over to Ukraine, and what we in particular have encouraged every member of the coalition to provide is air defense, because we see air defense for making a huge difference, not just in protecting critical infrastructure, but when you create these bubbles of protection, we see the economy being able to come back to life, and we see people, whether they're business people or consumers, coming back into active engagement. So we're pressing all members of the coalition to the extent that they can to provide that air defense, whether it's the system or the interceptors, and of course ammunition. The biggest need right now is 155 millimeter artillery. With U.S. assistance, the supplemental still held up. We're looking at a situation in which folks on the front line in Ukraine are reporting that they have something like 15 to 20 bullets per soldier per day. So that's not good. Russia has a good supply, and we're seeing more activity between Russia and not only North Korea, but Iran as well. And then we're also seeing the Russians ramping up their own homegrown defense industrial base. So the rest of us have to at least keep pace with that to enable the Ukrainians to respond. The objective for us in supporting Ukraine is not simply to enable them to persevere and just kind of, get strung along here. We want them to win. And the president's been very clear about that, and more clear about that in recent days than ever before, that we want Ukraine to win. So far in 2024, it has been a difficult year. I don't think that anybody can deny that. But before people start again, calling the war in favor of Russia, I think we should remember back again to 2 years ago, when everybody thought that the Ukrainians would be down for the count in no time, and they continue to beat expectations and to be able to maximize the assistance that the United States and other countries have provided in ways that are really impressive.
Thank you, Ambassador.
And Tong Kim, it's great to see you
okay.
again.
Go ahead. Chung-Soo Lee, go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador. What is the ultimate objective that will have the United States declare that we have won?
So I think it's not a matter for, we're not party to the war, right? So it's not for us to declare whether the war is won or lost. That's actually going to be between the parties involved, and we have picked a side in this. We want Ukraine to win. And I know we constantly see these reports about the United States is trying to push the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. And we try to dispel those rumors. Our objective is to support Ukraine so that they can actually win on the battlefield. Short of that, if they decide to go to the negotiating table, that they're able to go with the strongest hand possible. Understanding, as I pointed out, that Russia has a humongous advantage over Ukraine, just in terms of sheer size and throw weight. So that's why it's really important for us to come through with the supplemental assistance, supplemental aid for Ukraine as soon as possible. we're really heartened by the fact that when the measure was up before the Senate side, it passed by a huge margin, 70 to 20 something. And our assessment is that if the supplemental comes up on the House side, that it would pass by a similarly, authoritative margin. So that's what we're aiming for. Our basic principle when it comes to supporting Ukraine and their decision making on this is we will offer our best advice. We offer our best military advice, and we provide the defense materials that we believe they need to succeed, to win the war. And we make sure that there's nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So anybody who thinks that we're going to be negotiating on behalf of the Ukrainians or without the knowledge of the Ukrainians has got it very wrong. The other thing I'd say about prospects for negotiations is you've seen these news reports of Putin or Lavrov making statements that they really want to negotiate, but the Americans are preventing it. It's all nonsense. We need to be looking at actions and not words. And I would take us back to the fall and winter of 2021-22, when the United States was seeing clear indicators that Russia was preparing to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We shared that information with allies and partners. We eventually made that information public. And you will recall that the Russians very unequivocally denied that they had any intention of going into Ukraine. Putin clearly lied. And I don't think that he has now suddenly turned into a truth teller. So rather than get distracted by the various political statements that come out of Moscow, I think we need to be looking at actions and using a bit of common sense to figure out what the Russian intention really is.
Thank you, Ambassador. Sang-ho Song, go ahead. Song Sang-ho. Song Sang-ho, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, good. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. I'm very glad to see you again. You talked about air defense needed for Ukrainian forces. Has the U.S. government ever made an official request for South Korea to provide that or any specific weapons? And you said Korea has provided actual defense support. I mean, can you be more specific about that? Do you mean like demining equipment? Why I'm saying this is that Korea's position, I think, remains unchanged, that it's committed to humanitarian non-lethal support, not lethal weapons provision. So can you be specific about that?
So we've made this request and this emphasis on air defense very broadly to all coalition members.
So like more than 50 people.
So all 50 coalition members understand that there's a great need on air defense.
And there was recently a news report about the arrival of North Korean workers. Do you have any evidence or indications that they are, the North Korean workers are working in Russia's military defense industry or factories in Russia?
So I don't have anything that I can share on that.
Can I have one more question? In a fact sheet on Friday, the State Department said that North Korea has sent more than 10,000 containers of munitions and related materials to Russia. And that's a big increase compared with what the White House said in October. The White House talked about more than 1,000, but now it's talking about more than 10,000. So does this mean sanctions are not working? What do you see this?
I think that what it means is that a permanent member of the Security Council is willfully violating the very sanctions that it voted for.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador. Don Kirk, go ahead.
Well, one thing that concerns me is whether we're overextended. We're supporting the Israelis in Gaza, and we have concerns about North Korea's intentions and vis-a-vis South Korea. and China's intentions vis-a-vis Taiwan and the South China Sea. So if there's some concern we're doing a little too much, and that we really do not have the the ability to wage war on 3 or 4 fronts if that comes to pass.
I'm sorry, Ambassador, you were cutting in and out. Dr. Kim or whoever is at ICAS, could I suggest having everybody who's not speaking be muted so that we can actually hear?
Okay, I'm just wondering whether or not we're concerned about overextending with supporting the Israelis in Gaza, and concerned about what North Korea is up to in Northeast Asia vis-a-vis South Korea and Japan, and China vis-a-vis Taiwan and the South China Sea, among other places. Isn't that more than we can really handle?
I mean, it would. I'd get fired if I told you if I agreed with you. Look, the United States is, we've got tremendous capacity and capabilities, and we don't at this point think that there is a trade-off between support for Israel versus support for Ukraine. Our ability to pay attention to what's happening in the Asia Pacific versus what's happening in the Middle East or Europe. We can, walk and chew gum at the same time. And it's a lot of gum and a lot of walking, but we can do it. And I think that we need every part of the U.S. government, of course, to play their part, including Congress. We need some supplemental funding here so that the State Department, the Defense Department, all the various departments and agencies of the U.S. government can come together to do what we need to do for our own national security interests. And again, this is the emphasis that we place here, that we're not doing this because we're nice guys and we've got extra cash lying around. We need to do this because it's in our own interest. We've already seen that if you do some of the analysis and you do kind of the counterfactuals, if we think that the $75 billion that we've provided to Ukraine is expensive, well, the bill that we'd have if we had to confront an emboldened Russia that goes directly against NATO allies, or that inspires others to similar adventure, well, that's going to be a bill that none of us will want to face, and that's going to be a bill in blood and treasure. So I think we've got to be serious here and understand that it is time for decisive action on our part. I think, Ambassador, that we are truly at an inflection point. I've been hearing people, and I think you've been hearing people for a long time now. It's quite fashionable to say we are at an inflection point. We are at an inflection point. We are truly, actually, now at an inflection point.
Thank you.
Paul Gallagher, go ahead.
Good evening, Ambassador, and thank you for your insights. I'm sure you've been following the progress of the Ukraine aid bill in the Congress. If the U.S. Congress does not approve further aid to Ukraine, will the DPRK take that to mean we cannot be trusted to defend the ROK and be emboldened to take a more aggressive posture?
So as we've been discussing since we started, tonight's program, what we do in Ukraine really matters because friend and foe alike are watching. And the administration is confident that when the supplemental bill comes up for a vote in the House, that we will see it passed and supported by a wide margin, similar to what we saw on the Senate side. So, we're confident this is going to get done. It is a painful process, and it's probably a lot more painful than any one of us might wish. But we're confident that it's going to get done. But we do want to inject a greater sense of urgency here.
So you're not worried about the DPRK?
I wouldn't put it that way. Watching what happens with the DPRK, around the DPRK, by the DPRK, is a priority for this administration, as it has been for just about every administration since the 90s, when we started seeing indications of North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Worry is not the right word, because we're not kind of sitting in our offices wringing our hands and worrying. What we are is focused on trying to figure out how we can be as effective in moving North Korea as possible. I don't think anyone is going to pretend that this is an easy task, but we have built a very strong partnership, especially with the ROK and with Japan. And we've done that with other countries in the region as well, who recognize that a nuclear-armed North Korea is not in their interest. I think one of the areas that's going to be important to watch is what the Chinese think of the burgeoning military relationship and mutual, what is it called? Mutual enabling activity between Russia and the DPRK. I don't think the Chinese like that very much, for good reason. It's one thing for them to have a problem that they can more or less control and manipulate vis-a-vis us. It's another to have that role suddenly usurped by a competitive power. So I would watch that space very carefully.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. Eugene Kim, go ahead. Eugene, go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador, for doing this. I have two quick questions. So, could you give us any insights into what DPRK is getting out of in exchange of selling and supporting arms to Russia? And my second question is, as you mentioned, NATO has really been revived and expanded due to US leadership and initiatives. So I wonder whether you could address any concerns about, in November election, if a US leader who is more isolationist leaning will be elected. Like around Europe and in Asian countries, there are a lot of concerns about, NATO and other alliances being weakened and diminished.
Yeah, I'm not a fortune teller, so I can't tell you what'll happen in November or elsewhere. But what I can say is that we've seen NATO become, as I said, bigger, stronger, more relevant than it has been ever. And so we're putting in place a lot of efforts to make sure that every member of the alliance is contributing in ways that make NATO sustainable over the long term, right? And that protect it from some of the political criticism that has sometimes been directed towards it. I think a lot of Americans with World War II in the rearview mirror, and that generation of folks who lived through the war or had direct impact from the war, as that generation dies away, we're kind of losing sight of what war actually means. Right? We all know it in theory, but I think that generation of Americans who have that direct contact with war and its impact we're losing that. And because NATO has been so successful in preserving the peace and providing that undergirding for American power, prosperity, and security over the last 80 years, because NATO has been so successful, a lot of people have not really thought about it. And when we do think about it, we think of it in terms of, are the Europeans free riders in this system? We have a pledge to each other to defend each other, one for all for one, the sacred pledge that's contained in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty that established NATO. But all of us have to do our part. And a few years ago, actually 10 years ago in Wales, NATO allies agreed that we would all commit at least 2% of our GDP to defense spending, and then 20% of that to capital improvements and things like equipment and such. And what we've seen is, in the last couple of years in particular, a greater sense of urgency. And I'm not going to lie, I think President Trump, really kind of was shown the spotlight on that issue. And I think there were questions to be asked about burden sharing. And I think the point has gotten across. So now we've got, as we head towards the Washington summit in July, that'll take place this year to celebrate 75 years, we'll probably have somewhere between 18 to 20 allies achieving the 2% mark. And that's a big change, actually, from where we were 3 years ago. And I can certainly say where we were 10 years ago when we all agreed to that 2% marker. We do have to ensure that the alliance is as capable and as forward-facing as possible. So we're good with the conventional threats that we have traditionally faced. We're now very hard at work making sure that we can do the same on the cyber front, that we're effective in countering disinformation, that we're able to deal with technology and make sure that we can both use it to our advantage and to be able to counter it when it's deployed against the United States or any of our allies. We've also expanded the partnerships that we have. So we have these partnership relationships not only with countries in other parts of Europe that are not part of NATO yet, like the Balkans, for example, but we're doing it with the Middle East and increasingly with the Indo-Pacific region. And so as part of the Washington summit that's coming up in July, we're looking at ways that we can strengthen that the partnership that we have with the so-called IP4, right? That's the ROK, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and just really solidify those relationships.
Thank you, Ambassador. David Lee, are you out there?
Hi.
Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Ambassador, so much for being here today. You touched on this briefly, and I was hoping if you could provide a bit more for us. With Russia's disinformation campaign becoming such a major part of the US news cycle throughout the election season, I was hoping if you could get some insight on how these disinformation campaigns have functioned in the Eurasian regions, how successful they've been, if they've been as pervasive there as they are here in the United States, and if there's some universal strategy that the State Department has found effective in dealing with them both domestically and abroad.
Thank you. That's a great question. And we have an office actually in the State Department called the Global Engagement Center. that was established specifically to deal with misinformation and disinformation. You know, I've stepped away from the Asia world, so I'm not as familiar with how pervasive disinformation, misinformation might be in the EAP world now. But what I can tell you that is in Europe, we see it mutating all the time, and it's quite pervasive. And part of the challenge that we have as the United States in responding to misinfo, disinfo is that we actually do care about telling the truth, and we care about facts. And so some of the tactics that the Russians, for example, use in proliferating their point of view or in manipulating political dynamics in the United States and in other democracies, we don't use similar tactics, right? So it is a challenge to respond quickly to what they do.
Don Cook, do you have a follow-up question? If not, William Jasper, go ahead.
Actually, you know what,
Sure.
Dr. Kim, you know, while I have this opportunity, I don't know if Don Kirk is still with us.
I'm with you.
You know, I'm really, I mean, you asked a very nuanced and meaty question, and I'd be curious to know what your read on the situation is. I think I can guess some of the contours, but I'd be very interested to know what you think.
Well, you asked me. I'm worried about the U.S. in general. I've been worried about the U.S. in general since the Vietnam War, which I covered, and which ended very unhappy. Although Vietnam is now in a good place, I think, comparatively speaking. And obviously, what happened in Afghanistan and a few other things also is a matter of concern. And I don't find President Biden exactly a really strong figure. By the way, I think Trump might screw things up totally. So I do think we have the leadership we need. Period. End of opinion.
Thank you, Don. Bill Brown, go ahead.
Thank you. I think my mic is on now.
Okay, Larry, go ahead.
Ambassador Kim, you described the war between Russia and Ukraine from the Russian standpoint as a strategic failure, and you did highlight what was surprising to many of us, the Ukrainian successes. However, in the last 10 months, there have been some significant failures. Two I will highlight at this point before I ask my questions. Number one, the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive last year to even come close to seizing the areas around what we call the Russian seized land bridge to Crimea. Counteroffensive failed. Secondly, according to the Washington Post, U.S. sanctions have not had the effects on Russia's economy than American experts predicted. Simply put, according to the Washington Post, experts anticipate Russia having an economic growth rate this year of 2.6% compared to an expected U.S. growth rate of 2.1%. Now, reports on U.S. intelligence assessments indicate that Ukraine this year, the Ukrainians will not have any major military offensive capabilities. And the question becomes, can they hold now what they have now? And the Russians have already seized one medium-sized city in the Donetsk region just in the last week to 10 days. And more Russian military offensive pressure is anticipated this year. So I have two questions. First of all, if the Ukrainians are successful enough to preserve the stalemate as we get into the fall of this year, then is it going to be time or perhaps necessary to sustain U.S. support for Ukraine to really start thinking about a negotiating strategy between Ukraine and Russia, but even perhaps involving the U.S. and some other NATO countries? Is a negotiating strategy going to be necessary if this stalemate, World War I type stalemate, continues? Secondly, if the deadlock in Congress, which has been mentioned, continues over, I think, the $64 billion that President Biden has proposed in military aid to Ukraine, at that point, if we get into the summer and you have a continued stalemate or even Ukrainian losses, and this congressional stalemate continues, is the administration and the State Department going to have to, I think, give more serious consideration to unlocking the $300 billion in frozen Russian bank assets, most of which are held in European banks, mostly the NATO country banks in Europe, but some of which is also held in US banks, to free up $300 billion that can substitute for the frozen congressional deadlock over the president's proposal for $64 billion aid to Ukraine. When do we have to cross that bridge to unlocking that $300 billion for Ukraine?
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, so I think you're seeing what all of us see, which is that the counteroffensive did not produce that immediate dramatic victory that we all might have hoped for. That it's dragged on, and I don't think I can add anything to what Zelensky and his until recently his commanding general Zaluzhny, their description of how tough the counteroffensive had been, what a slog it has been. I think the expectation is that 2024 is going to be difficult on the battlefield and off the battlefield for a number of reasons. There's elections in key countries, not just our own, but we've also got European elections and a number of other political events taking place that will complicate the scenario. On impact of sanctions on Russia, again, not as dramatic as I think people had hoped for, but we do see the deleterious effect that the sanctions have had. For one thing, one of the biggest things that's happened is that the Europeans, within 2 years, have essentially wean themselves off of dependency on Russian oil and gas. And if you hearken back to 2022, 2023, the early part of it, you'll remember how difficult it was, these conversations that we were having with the Europeans. There were some who continued to believe that what they were seeing couldn't possibly be what they were seeing. And that, maybe Putin wanted just a little bite. And once he had that bite, if we just let him keep it, it's all going to be okay. Putin's behavior is showing clearly that that's not actually what he intends. He's not looking for a snack. You know, if you look at what he's done since he's been in power, just with respect to Ukraine, look at the action that he took against Crimea in 2014, and then Donetsk and Luhansk shortly in conjunction with that. He continues to hold 20% of Georgia's territory, and he's essentially turned Belarus into a puppet state. His people are unable to travel. He himself is mostly unable to travel. We're looking at declines in GDP. Growth of the economy is sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't challenge you on the figures that you cite, but the Russian economy was actually projected to grow much more than what we're seeing now, and they've essentially turned themselves into a pariah on the world stage, also unable to tap into the global financial system, a great deal of which we essentially, the United States, are able to, we dominate that. So if you're declared, if you're sanctioned by the US Treasury, you're more or less done on the international stage for financial transactions. So that's why we see Russia turning to North Korea and to Iran, and currying favor with the Chinese, all of which I have to say, I think from a historical perspective, has got to be pretty humiliating for the Russians to have to do. On your specific point about use of Russian sovereign assets, yes, that's a very active conversation. And there are a number of ideas being pitched, and that's about all I can say about that. But the basic principled position on our part is that Russia has to pay for the damage that it's caused in a literal sense as well, right? So in combination with the activities of Penny Pritzker, our former Secretary of Commerce, who's taken on the role of special representative for Ukrainian economic recovery and reconstruction, she's been working with the private sector and with foreign governments to draw investment into Ukraine and to look at particular sectors that are promising or necessary. That combined with reforms and then looking at creative ways to both impose a cost but also pay some of these bills that are accruing because of Russia's aggression and the choices that Putin is making. So that's a complicated way of saying, yes, we're looking at the things that you're suggesting that we should be looking at.
Including negotiations.
You know, again, that's a decision for the Ukrainians to make. But we should be, you know, we need to be looking at the full board here of options available. But the decision to go to the negotiating table ultimately belongs to Ukraine. And we want to be in a position to support them to the greatest degree possible so that they go in with a strong hand, if that's where they decide to go.
Thank you, Ambassador. Bill Brown, go ahead. Bill.
Yes, thank you. Actually, a couple of questions have already been asked. One on the sanctions on North Korea. You just have to think sale of artillery shells to Russia pretty much destroys the UN sanctions. I mean, I don't know how to get around that. It seems like, you know, we've had a lot of trouble before, but now this is just over the top. And it seems like the sanctions regime, at least the UN sanctions regime, is just totally gone. I don't know why we even talk about it anymore. Totally ineffective. And are we, I guess the question for the State Department, are we reevaluating that whole system. Yeah, Russians signed on to it and they're not doing it. China has a lot of trouble with it too. There are a lot of our problems with it as well. It's not, sanctions have been overused and poorly used for 10 years now. And we see no results coming from them. So I don't know. I would ask you if we're.
I
reviewing the
appreciate
sanctions-
I appreciate your frustration on that. But you know, just because you have lawbreakers, you don't throw out the law. There's a legal system in place that actually more serves a broader purpose. It is deeply, deeply troubling, right? There is something profoundly wrong when you have one of the permanent members of the Security Council doing the violating of these sanctions regimes that the Security Council has put in place. But I think we're not at a place where you know, we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. But there is frustration. I think there's no getting around that, there's a deficiency here.
And you know, there are some one positive thing is the Russians have not, you know, we've always worried that North Korea would start getting conventional high-tech weaponry, especially air defense, from Russia, or jet planes. And Russians haven't done that, neither have the Chinese. So North Korea is still not advancing its conventional weapon at all, seems like. But one other question I had, I like the way you put, what was it, for the Ukraine, that we all want, not most of us would want, Ukraine to have as strong a hand in negotiations as possible. And so that we want to give them a strong hand. That's, I think, a very good way to put it. But the question is that hand getting weaker over time? Seems like their stronger hand would have been a year ago, maybe even 2 years ago. It seems like they're losing. I mean, you say we want them to win, and maybe they haven't lost, but they're losing. It seems like their hand is getting weaker. And I'm not sure that any amount of money, I mean, we throw hundreds of billions of dollars at Afghanistan, and we throw billions of dollars around everywhere to very little effect. And I guess I'm just not thinking that $75 billion, it's a very large amount of money. It's an incredible number of bullets, if you think about it. It's billions and billions of bullets. What's so magical about that number, 75, 67, whatever? Could it be pared down? But I think more importantly, you know, is their hand weakening over time, and should they go ahead and try to negotiate some kind of peace? We're a player. Don't pretend like we're not a player. We're a big partner. We're paying for it, right? So we have a say in it. And it seems like it's a bit of a, you know, it doesn't seem like we should just pull out and say, we're not, it's just up to you to negotiate. It's up to us to negotiate how much money we're going to give you. And that's going to go into the equation. Anyway, just some thoughts, but I appreciate your comments.
Thank you. I think on the issue of, you know, is Ukraine losing or winning? You know, I think it's useful to take a look at the whole stretch from February 24, 2022 until this moment. I know right now things aren't as cheerful as you know, we'd want them to be. But if you look at the whole stretch of the past 2 years, again, you know, they've taken back more than 50% of the territory that the Russians initially took. They've destroyed 20% of the Black Sea Fleet. They've restarted the shipment of grains and other commodities out of Odessa. You know, that had been stopped because of the missiles that the Russians were raining down on that main port. And with the arrival and usage of air defense at Odessa and a number of key spots, and their cooperation with countries like Romania, Moldova, and others, they've been able to get those ships moving again. And I continue to remind myself that there are so many initiatives that we see working now that when they were at their nascent stage, everybody poo-pooed it. The idea of a humanitarian corridor, people laughed at that and said, well, how are they going to sustain this? That'll never work. The idea that Odessa could continue to be a functioning port, people were highly skeptical of that. The idea that the Ukrainians would still be a country that functions 2 years after that initial onslaught, I think that's pretty impressive. Now, it isn't to say that we can kind of rest on our laurels or let them rest on their laurels. We do have to keep the positive momentum up, and they've got to power through this moment where it does, General Zaluzhny referred to it as a stalemate, which I think really annoyed Zelensky. But in any event, it's a difficult moment. There's no getting around that, and we've got to enable them to push in now.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dan Kirk, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I just made a comment when Ambassador Kim asked me when I saw it. But I have almost a technical question, but not really technical. But you spoke about the air support that NATO, including the U.S., is giving Ukraine. But NATO, notably the U.S., is not actually flying air support against the Russians or declaring a no-fly zone or taking any steps like that. We've heard rational explanations for this, but I wonder if you could comment on it. How can you say that we're providing air support for Ukraine?
I didn't say that. I didn't say we're providing air support. I said that we're providing air defense systems.
Okay.
So
an outsider might not think there's a huge distinction between those terms.
Well, there's a. I mean,
I know what you're saying.
You know, there's a big difference between providing air defense systems and providing air support. Air support is talking about deploying air assets.
Yeah.
In a very targeted way, and we're not doing that. And I don't know that we're moving in that direction.
Why don't we try to enforce a no-fly zone?
Yeah, I think we're we're looking very carefully, and we want to avoid unintended consequences.
Right. No, I understand.
Yeah.
It's a very diplomatically phrased response, and I appreciate it. But some people might think we just don't have the guts to do what we need to do. What do you think?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Don. Tong, do you have a follow-up question? Tong,
Yes.
go ahead.
Given the state of affairs, including involving war in Ukraine and the Russia DPRK coalition and closer cooperation in terms of a support for Russian military adventure in Ukraine, how that affects the South Korean situation as well. Now, South Korea obviously has its own trouble, and at the same time, Russia DPRK cooperation, you said Chinese may not welcome that for good reason. I think I tend to agree with it. But nevertheless, we have another dimension of the problem. That means the Indo-Pacific strategy to contain Chinese ambition and influence in the Pacific Ocean and elsewhere. And we have our own security interests cooperating with allies of Japan and South Korea and so forth, so against China as well. Now, Are you satisfied with the way current administration has been pursuing its foreign policy toward these issues? Or
Well, Tong, there's only one answer to that from from a foreign service officer. Am I satisfied with the administration? The answer is yes. Right? That would have to. There's only one answer. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no, that's fine. Well, my question is, would you advise something else for the administration to pursue? Or there's no talks, no dialogue between North and South Korea, for example, issue regarding enemies, number one. And then there's no talks between Pyongyang and Washington. There's no talk on nuclear denuclearization, which they pursued for so many years, generations for that matter, no progress. And the Biden is running for the second administration. If he succeeds, I don't see anything they will do anything differently than they have been doing so far. It's the first administration. Would you are you satisfied with the way things are progressing, or moving forward, or going backward? Or what would you suggest to improve the situation?
Tong, so for those who don't know, Tong and I know each other from a long time ago. I first met him when I was a junior officer on my first assignment as a Foreign Service officer in Beijing, and I was assigned to look after who was it? Chuck Cartman, when he came through for negotiations with the North Koreans, and Tong was the interpreter. And then we saw each other again further down the line when I was working on the six-party talks. And then I've moved over to the Europe portfolio. I mentioned all of that to illustrate that, Tong, you were probably a lot more informed than I am, and in a better place to provide any advice on those issues than I am right now. I don't know that I've got a good answer for your very good question.
Thank you, Ambassador. Larry, next, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, Sangju. This question has to do with what I think is a very weak component of U.S. policy towards the Russian-Ukraine war. And that is in the area of propaganda. Now, I know some people view that word as a dirty word, but it really is about the message. And I'll just make a couple of quick points about that. There are several historical comparisons that can be made comparing Vladimir Putin and Joseph Stalin, and none of our officials seem to be making those comparisons. Now, when Finland joined NATO, for example, and even today, when Finns talk about why they joined NATO, so many of them reference Stalin's attack on Finland in the fall of 1939, the so-called Winter War, when everybody expected the Red Army would just overrun Finland and the Soviet Union would take it over, but the Finns held. And Stalin finally, as the spring appeared in 1940, decided he needed to cut and run and negotiate. What happened to Mr. Navalny is another comparison with Joseph Stalin and the gulags in Siberia and the millions of people who died in those gulags. Stalin sending the Red Army into the Baltic states in the summer of 1940 to take them over. What he did to the Ukrainians in the early 30s with his massive famine, killing millions of Ukrainian farmers, the kulaks, during that period. You have these comparisons. It seems to me whenever our officials make a statement about Vladimir Putin, we should just reference him repeatedly as the new Stalin and keep hammering away at this message, this comparison. But I don't see any indication that there's any thinking along these historical analogies, historical comparisons in terms of our messaging or propaganda, if you will. And I'm wondering why not? You know, why is there no thinking along these historical comparison lines with regard to our messages about leaders like Putin?
I agree with a lot of what you said. We kind of touched on this earlier on when I noted that so much of the generation that saw World War II or now even the Korean War and the impact of a terrifying land war like that, they're getting fewer and fewer in number. And so the crazy part now is that you know, tying Putin to Stalin will appeal and make sense to a certain segment, but it also will not make sense to a lot of people either. That isn't to say we shouldn't do it because it only gets you, you know, 30% as opposed to 100%, but just to kind of make an observation. The other part is that you know, we've seen some nostalgia, not least in Russia, for characters like Stalin. And this is partly what Putin appeals to. It's this sense of a great empire wronged, and you need a strong man so that Russia can be respected as it once was. And they're in vogue now. Strong men are in vogue all around the world.
Just one other comparison, if I may. I have read a story about Putin's parents and what happened to them during the German 900-day siege of Leningrad during World War II. His father, a soldier, being wounded permanently, and his mother almost dying and being found in a big pile of dead people and saved. Every time they bomb or missile attack a Ukrainian city and kill a bunch of civilians, we ought to be reminding Putin that you're doing what the Germans did to your mother and father.
Yeah.
That should be a reminder we hammer away every time he does this and get that message to him directly.
Thank you.
Very good. Masa Ota from Tokyo.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening there, and thank you very much, Ambassador. I have one quick, simple question regarding the potential nuclear use by Putin. What extent are you still concerned about the possibility of the Putin would use nuclear weapons against the Ukraine? Just the you know, it's a recent his demonstration getting aboard on the nuclear warfighter. It's a kind of a strategic signaling toward the NATO. So what's your sense about the you know, what extent are you concerned about the potential use of nuclear weapons by Putin? That's my question. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you. They have those nuclear weapons. They're able to use them. And you see us speaking about this very publicly. We watch that situation very closely to see where assets, personnel are being deployed, and what that tells us about intentions.
A follow-up question, Martha.
What was your most concerned time in the past 2 years? When did you feel the real, sense of urgency regarding the possible use of nuclear weapons by Putin? Maybe that was a time of the autumn 2022 when the Russian troops withdrew from Kharkov. That's my follow-up questions.
Yeah, there have been a number of occasions when the Russians have made noises about annihilating enemies and feeling forced to use them. But again, I don't know that it's meaningful for me to tell you when I felt most alarmed. I think the most useful thing is to say that we watch this very, very closely. We look at those. We look at the actions more than the words. That comes to matters of both, deployment of certain weapon systems, and we apply the same to when the Russians start talking about negotiations. My sense is they're throwing this stuff up in the air to distract and to try and fracture the coalition, right? Because there are, of course, naturally, we would love to see a negotiated settlement, and all of us can sing Kumbaya again. Some will be tempted to say that's exactly what we ought to do. And I think when we compare that to the actions that we see the Kremlin taking, we don't believe that that there is any truth behind the notion that they want to go to the negotiating table right now. So for us, when the Swiss or the Danes or even the Saudis, when they have convened these peace forums at the behest of the Ukrainians, we participate in all of those, and we'll continue to do that. Again, we want to put the Ukrainians in the strongest position possible to go to the negotiating table if that's what they choose to do. But our immediate objective now on the battlefield is to provide them with the support they need to win the war. It's not just to survive and live another day. It is actually, we want to see this war end in victory for Ukraine.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead. Pierre?
All right.
Go ahead.
Hi, Ambassador Kim. Thanks for your time. I have a few questions. I understand that, the U.S. current position is to support and, have the Ukraine win the war. But why not go far as allowing the Ukraine to join NATO if, in fact, that's if the U.S. is willing to support Ukraine in winning the war? I mean, the reason I'm asking this question is, no matter what the outcome of the war may be in the near future, and it seems at best right now, the some sort of a peace talk or a truce may be the outcome. But what's after that? It's 10th anniversary of the Russia's Crimean invasion. So unless U.S. is willing to allow the Ukraine to join NATO, I'm afraid that it's going to happen all over again. 10 years down the road, after Russia recovers from the damage from the war, they may go after Ukraine again. or some Baltic states. So in the long term, the only way to end this kind of invasion, threat to rest of the NATO country is to allow Ukraine to join NATO and to show that, strong determination to Putin or his successor that he can't really do this again. So I'd like to ask you, what should be the sort of a long-term policy, after the war ends in the near future? The other question also I have is, what if China, when China attacks or invades Taiwan, what if Chinese government asks cooperation of Russia government in simultaneously starting wars so as to weaken the U.S. Defense in involving both regions at the same time? And my last question is, there's you mentioned that there's the Ukraine and Russia war has evoked a strong partnership among among U.S. allies, but at the same time, I think it also has divulged the weaknesses in U.S. foreign policy, namely due to the fact that there's a change of climate in the domestic politics. So if with the administration change and the U.S. foreign policy, dramatic change in the U.S. foreign policy, how are the U.S. allies going to trust? For example, the South Korea's reliance on United States nuclear umbrella protection. Whenever domestic political climate changes, how is the U.S. going to convince its allies that the U.S. will stand by no matter what?
Look, again, I'm not in the business of fortune telling for the future. Countries have to make their own decisions based on the available information that they have and based on their past experience. And I would argue that for our allies around the world, their experience with the United States has shown that, more or less, we're pretty reliable and we're pretty capable. And we stick with our friends and allies. That said, people are watching, as we all acknowledge, people are watching very closely what the United States does with respect to Ukraine. Friend and foe alike are watching, and they're going to draw conclusions from that. And we try to emphasize this point to spur Congress to take action more decisively and more quickly. So that's that point. You made a lot of important points, and I'm not sure that I can address all of them. What issue would you really like me to address?
If you can just go ahead and answer the first question. Why not allow Ukraine to join NATO? Is the U.S. going to leave the Ukraine as a buffer zone? Then if that's the case, and I think it's going to happen again.
Yeah. So I think you'd agree with me that it's not a smart idea to just let every country under threat join because they're under threat and we can provide protection. That would be the craziest insurance policy known to human history. Okay, so that's I don't think that's workable. That said, President Biden's been super clear. Ukraine's future is in NATO, And our job now is to get them as prepared as possible, as quickly as possible, so that they can be a capable member of the alliance. It's really important to keep in mind that, again, NATO is not a charity organization. It is a defense alliance. Allies have an obligation to each other, and we must have both the will and the capability to defend each other if necessary. So we want to get Ukraine in the right place. So we are working with them to make sure that they are developing their military in a way and procuring equipment in a way that will make them interoperable with NATO allies. We are working with them so that they can get institutions and procedures in place so that they're aligned with the rest of NATO. It is very challenging because not every NATO ally is the same, and sometimes there are changes over time depending on what's happening in the country. So to be totally blunt, for example, Hungary, you know, they're not exactly you know, the loveliest allies at the moment, but they are part of the alliance, and we need to be able to have institutions in place that can manage those differences and sustain the alliance over the longer term. So the answer to your question on Ukraine and NATO is that we see them in NATO. They will be part of NATO. And we need to do the work that's necessary so that we can click them into place. And we're not going to be rushed on that. Our first and last interest is the national security of this country and the safety, security, and prosperity of the American people. And I don't think we should be taking rushed decisions for any other set of reasons beyond those.
Okay, thanks for your answering.
Thank you, Ambassador. Would you be good enough to take one last question from a student? Okay, he's there. Chung, go ahead. Last one.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim, for your time and insights. My name is Hee-jae Jung. I'm a student at Azusa Pacific University in California. I'm majoring in international relations and honors humanities, and it's my honor to ask a question. My career goal is to promote the human rights of North Korean people, so I want to ask you about the relationship between human rights violation in North Korea and its relationship to U.S. national security. So how do the human rights violation in North Korea, such as political repression and labor camps, impact regional stability and potentially affect U.S. interests in East Asia? Thank you.
So we see a direct connection between the sustainability of political systems and the rights that they not only articulate for their populations, but actually deliver. So there's a huge difference between countries like the United States, South Korea, Japan, and much of Western Europe that operate on the basis of the rule of law. And countries like North Korea, where you know, the kindest thing you could say is rule by law, right? To the extent that they have their legal system, they set a political objective, and then they manipulate and realign the legal argument to achieve that end. So there is a direct connection. We've long been concerned by the human rights violations that we see credibly reported out of North Korea. It's hard to, I don't think we have the full scope on that because we don't have diplomatic relations, and we rely, for example, on the Swedes who are there as our protecting power to share information with us, also the Brits and other friends who are there. But it's difficult, and we're assisted by technology, so you get satellite coverage, and you can see, for example, camps, mass graves, things of that nature. Those were all things that we looked out for when we were working on the six-party talks. And I'm sure that that's what my colleagues are doing now as well. We've long had an envoy who very intentionally focuses on the human rights situation in North Korea. So that, I don't think that's going to change.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kim. Ladies and gentlemen, the proceeding is adjourned. Ambassador, we'll get back to you. Thank you very much again. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a great pleasure and an honor to be with you, and to get to speak with some of the very distinguished participants in today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.